all the people that are now in power that dismantled the NIH, Bhattacharya, he was part of, biosafety now. These are people that you have to question why suddenly are they in power. And I think there's an argument to be made that, this is part of the COVID contrarianism and abusing the trauma of the pandemic to kind of create this story that is very satisfying to say, the scientists up, and if we prevent them from ever doing it again, we will have no pandemic anymore.
When people mix up dates or when people do things like that, like, like the first one might have actually been in like early October or something, or maybe even late August. And it's like, do you understand when you say that there should be hundreds of thousands of cases so much earlier? Like, it's just, that's impossible. And then, like you said, like for hospitalization.
The pandemic 2 months forward. And then,
it's just, it's the math is impossible to beat there. Yeah. So you're a researcher who, I noticed you're like, I guess, chapter by chapter publishing a book related to.
I'm not a researcher anymore. So I was a researcher. I was 10 years kind of in biological labs, did a PhD, postdoc, also in a machine learning lab then after. And then I decided to kind of do more science communication. Now I work in the life science industry, and all the other science communication part is something that I do as a hobby, more or less, you can say, right?
Gotcha.
But that's not the whole story. So I got kind of the opportunity to kind of meet WHO members. I think the only person in the West that talked to the head of the Chinese CDC, George Gao, and the woman in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, just because I was like, hey, I had this crazy idea. Let's talk to the scientists that everybody says, they did something. Let's talk to them, hear their side of the story, right? And this is basically what this book is about, telling, hey, what were you doing? What did you find out? And then on the other side, why is nobody believing you, and why are people running away with kind of the opposite story? So
yeah. Okay. So I'm kind of curious, as somebody who is wait, real quick before we do that. So when you said you were a researcher, what was your like formal background in researching? Just so people have like a general idea of my audience. Also, I'm live and streaming.
So I came from a chemistry background. So did like technical chemistry, it's called in Austria, and then biochemistry later, and then I did a PhD in molecular biomedicine. This was cancer research based, working on pancreatic cancer, but also on some of these, virus constructs in order to kind of, get genetic cargo into, embryonic stem cells and other mouse models and stuff like this. So, a lot of molecular cloning on the bench kind of work. And then later I switched more to computer science because, biology was also at this point kind of moving to become, data became destiny in the sense that, big methods, started coming, and you needed some kind of statistical training or computer science background to analyze these data. So I did 2 years there. Yeah.
Okay, so what was the entry point for you to become kind of interested in the communication around the COVID stuff?
So it was funny because I was not, I kind of left in the middle of the pandemic. So it was in 2021. I left academia, and I had this idea, let's because, let's talk about science, let's bring some scientific literacy. It was at the time when the anti-vax sentiment started increasing and people were pushing ivermectin and these kind of stories. And I was like, okay, and also the lab leak story started getting mainstream in 2021, right? And so, and a colleague of mine kind of looked me in, hey, you're a biologist, let's get Yuri digging on, let's have a conversation. And this is basically what put me on the map, where I kind of was the counterpart to Yuri in this debate that my friend set up.
Okay.
And then, got a lot of negative feedback. And so the first intuition as a scientist is like, oh God, we messed up. There's a lot of things we didn't know. And so we kind of started interviewing, virologists that are like senior professors that were
wait real quick
papers.
When you say you got a lot of negative feedback, was this from other people in academia, or do you just mean like the public that was like fighting against you? Because
I'm talking about mostly the vocal Twitter community.
Okay.
So that people, it's like, I've been writing scientific blog posts since my PhD for years, and sometimes, most of the time nobody cares. Sometimes it's positive feedback and it's like, it's a really nice story, thank you very much. And this was the first time where people like, you're a CCP shill, and you're paid off and you're part of the cover up. And so I kind of get to because of this, polarization that was happening very strongly, I got pushed closer and closer to the scientists that were actually on the other side of this. And then, they saw, hey, this guy, he seems normal, let's talk to him, and my colleague, right? And so we kind of got a couple of very high profile podcast episodes that nobody ever did, which is the crazy part, because you have all these journalists, you would assume they would have an interest in this topic. They go for the sound bites, and they go for like, hey, can we do what do you have to say to this? What do you have to say to this? And we were just like, let's have a 2-hour conversation about your research and what you think happened. And that went quite well for us. So this was our entry point, basically. And then it got a bit crazy because then I wrote this very long blog post, like 12,000 words, where I kind of put out all the evidence we had together. And then I said, look, you can worry about labs, but, biosafety doesn't stop, at the lab door. Once outside, there's a way higher risk from this zoonotic spillovers that happens 10,000s of times and stuff like this. And that kind of then put me on the map for, there were some journalists that covered this, but then there was also this Swiss filmmaker that kind of said, I needed you to come to be part of my documentary. And he looped me in, and then he brought me in contact with Peter Daszak, who is, the guy from Eco Health Alliance that everybody hates now. And then, we started, I had like unique access to him for like 2 weeks when we were, on the field trip in Thailand. And then so, this is basically what got the ball rolling for me to get deeper and deeper into this. And at some point I was like in there, having interviewed all these people, having, also the background to understand what they were talking about. And it's like, okay, I have to do something about it. Let's tell their story, right? And this is what I've been doing. Yeah.
Gotcha. Do you? I'm trying to think before we start. So we traded emails a little bit because our mutual friends at Decoding the Gurus recommended it, and I said generally I only do adversarial conversations because
exactly.
Is there anything in particular you want to talk about? Because if not, there's a million questions I can ask. I'm kind of curious from a professional background and researcher background.
No, I mean, I also didn't have you on the map. I knew you from back in your StarCraft days. I mean, I also was a gamer at some point, maybe 10 years ago. But then suddenly you had Peter Miller on, right? And Peter Miller is the COVID debater. So we have been getting close because, because of the debunkings, and also Peter Miller reached out when he had this debate before, and it's like, if I would be available, if he needed some help with some stuff. And I have a funny anecdote actually, because he said then he got the questions from SAR, and he was like, this is a joke, I don't need your help, is what he told me basically. And he got it. I mean, you saw the debate, right? So he got it. And so this was kind of the entry to this. And then Peter said actually, hey, why don't you talk to Destiny about this? And then it's like, why Destiny? And then it's like, he's been doing some COVID stuff. And I was like, okay, let's check it out. And then I've seen you've been doing a lot, and so I've been trying to catch up a bit the topics you've been doing. And it's like, let's have a chat, and can be adversarial as well. I'm very much on the pro zoonosis side in that sense. If you want to do the negative part, we can play that. That's fine.
Sure. I think probably I said this a lot. My biggest issue was I felt like going into it just because of like stuff that I've heard, and I consider myself like a decently informed person, probably more informed actually than most. When the average podcast was like Joe Rogan, I was saying probably more informed than most. And I would say I was kind of like 65-35, 60-40 maybe, kind of on the lab leak side, prior to going into that debate, the big SAR Peter debate. Just because I'd heard about intelligence communities, kind of figured that they started to change their position slightly, and then there was one other thing. Just like the general, like, well, there's a lab there, and maybe, I don't know, I guess it's possible. And I was really irritated because after going through that debate and then like studying more barely of whatever little bits of molecular biology, in order to understand the stuff, I feel very, 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 very misled. Now I'm like, it's like a 98-2. Like, I don't know how you could possibly think it came from a lab. There are so many things that would have to be different for you to think that it came from the lab. And I guess I'm irritated that I feel like this position is completely and totally unrepresented in the entirety of all alternative mainstream media. Because even like the liberal news networks in America will say like, oh, well, now we know it, like it probably came from a lab. And it's like, it's literally almost unfathomable.
RFK Jr. published this book, right? The Wuhan cover-up and the terrifying bioweapons arms race, right? I mean, now he's health secretary. All the people that are now in power that dismantle the NIH, Bhattacharya, he was part of, biosafety now. These are people that you have to question, why suddenly are they in power? And I think there's an argument to be made that, this is part of the COVID contrarianism and abusing the trauma of the pandemic to kind of create this story that is very satisfying to say, the scientists up, and if we prevent them from ever doing it again, we will have no pandemic anymore. Unfortunately, reality is a bit different, and so it's a bit hard to justify this stance if you want to prevent, future pandemic crises and similar.
Yeah, I think that's always my biggest complaint about all the misinformation stuff is that you waste so much time debating totally irrelevant stuff that I think there's like a fascinating ocean of conversation you could have about other things, and we just never have any of that conversation.
You never go to the next point and now we're at this point where we have to debate what actually happened, right? Again and again, because those in power like to rewrite the history. And
You're so completely wrong. I wish you were. Maybe it's like that in Switzerland. We're past that point. Now we're at the point of we're just defunding all of the research in the programs because we already know that it happened.
Oh yeah, no, I know.
Yeah, it's like complete. Like we just pulled funding from 23 all the mRNA vax research in the U.S. They just pulled the funding from because I don't know if you learned this in school, but when you get a vaccine and then a disease infects you, the disease will change to adapt to new hosts. So apparently that's because of vaccines and it's bad. So we're getting rid of vaccines, and apparently vaccines don't work for respiratory illnesses. Those are the two things that RFK said. And I just
they get deflected by the magical nose mucosa.
Maybe their hairs are too long. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. So I'm curious in Europe, is it as bad? I have a friend from Switzerland. Not yet. I have a friend from Switzerland, and they told me that their mom has like really strong feelings now about like trans people because of U.S. media that they've started to listen to. Is it getting worse in Europe, or is it significantly different from the U.S.? Or
So I think the U.S. is a bit ahead, a few years, and if Europe doesn't, work on digital sovereignty and getting control of its information environment, we will go the same route. So I think it's a feature of, the US being ahead in the sense of they have been the first, the most digital, the most people online. And then also you have a very susceptible system for this kind of polarization because you have only a two-party system. In Europe, at least we have, more parties and, it's harder to aggregate around two hard poles. But we see the same narratives that get seeded and amplified by the right-wing machine that they built also in Europe, swapping over, using the same emotional arguments to get people to participate with outrage and then, start to shape people's perception of reality and with it then their worldview and how they vote. I mean, it's a very clear political strategy from autocratic parties or very right-wing reactionary parties in multiple countries, and it's well documented at this point. And yeah.
Have you ever met anybody in real life? Again, I guess maybe the people in Europe aren't quite as radicalized, but have you met anybody in real life that you've been able to persuade away from any of the crazy kind of like vaccine stuff or COVID stuff? Or like what are strategies, I guess, that you feel work for you when you're talking to, I don't know, friends and coworkers might be different, but like people that are not like in your immediate social circle? Is there something that works better than most other things? Or?
So, I mean, confrontation usually does not work well. I have the feeling this is something the best thing you can do is, either lead by example and say, this is why I do it. And I think it's reasonable because of this. You give some good arguments. And then, you hope that, people that are not too upset with you kind of say, okay, maybe he has a reasonable point. So you kind of auto-normalize a little bit, the right behavior. The second thing you can do is you can try to, how should I put this? You can try to nudge people, but nudge in a way of like, setting prompts for accuracy is like, actually, are you sure? Ask them to question themselves. And then if you spawn their interest in figuring out what it actually do, because most people, everybody from us probably believes something that's not completely true. And then we all have an innate drive to kind of want to know what is really true, although I think some of that can be subdued when the political identity is too strong.
Yeah.
But most people, most of the time, want to have good information and act based on some type of rational analysis. And you need actually a lot of effort to keep people, trapped in a false universe. And this is what I think at the moment we see it, social media enabled a lot. You constantly keep people, coming back and keeping them engaged to create this alternative reality and sustain it. And I think this is something that that's new. That's something that we didn't have, or maybe we had in the past when we talk about, classical old propaganda, and now we have created it for ourselves, and we have to figure out a way forward.
Yeah.
But it's actually, it's a topic that I think everybody is wondering about, and I've been working with some, people like the cyber minister from Taiwan and Audrey Tang, who, because Taiwan had kind of like, high polarization, constant disinformation from the Chinese mainland, constantly under threat. And they figured out how to kind of get government from 10% trust up to 70% in a short amount of time. So what are these lessons learned, right, for democracy? And so this is something I'm currently looking into based on very much what I observed with what we see with this lab leak story, because, I would say by 2022, mid of 2022, the scientific evidence was like entirely one-sided and so strong that there was no rational discussion to be had anymore about, if a lab leak is a realistic scenario, because there could not be a scientific hypothesis. So the lab leak itself is kind of I would call it a myth or a narrative that is based on multiple mutually contradictory ideas and allegations and suspicions, but it's not a coherent scientific theory. And the biggest problem...
Wait, real quick. Can you do me a favor? Yeah. I think your mic is the thing on top. Can you bring it down in front of your lips? Because sometimes it's hard to catch your...
No, actually, I have this here, but maybe that's worse.
Oh.
I can try to switch.
No, wait. You can use the one in front of you, but lean in a little closer, because sometimes it's when you lean back, it's hard to hear.
I can put it closer, maybe.
Okay.
I try to keep my voice down because of the kids, but sure.
Yeah, that's fine. As long as you're close, it'll be consistent. Yeah. You were bringing up that was a thing I noticed in Peter's debate and in all these debates, that when you talk about like the lab leak theory, that there's absolutely no coherent and consistent start to finish, like what is your lab leak theory? Because a lot of them are, you're correct, a lot of them are like mutually exclusive. Like these two different theories can't be true at the same time, but people will like borrow from different ones depending on what part of the story they're telling you.
And this is the problem I have with it, because I also started kind of as a believer in the lab leak theory, because I thought I worked in a lab, I've seen lab accidents happen. It's something you never should it's possible, right? I mean, I know stories about wrongful discarding of infectious material, accident, animal bites or whatever, right? These things can happen, and so I was very much prone to this idea, but then if you really think about the problems that the lab leak theory has to solve, they have nothing to do with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because you can assume that this lab, has 100% leakage rate of every virus they ever had, and it still would not move the needle at all towards the lab leak theory. So all these discussions about biosafety do not move the needle at all, because the biggest problems they have is the upstream and the downstream problem, I call it. The upstream problem is, how does a pandemic-ready virus like SARS-CoV-2 come together? Because researchers cannot create a virus like this.
Or they could, but it would have required like 10 years of top secret research that was never published and nobody knew anything about, and was doing things like computer models like didn't predict or whatever. There's that.
So at least in 2019, we are pretty confident that nobody could have created a virus like SARS-CoV-2, I would say. Because, a virus is not just about, creating a genetic sequence. A virus is really about trying to figure out how to create something that can work in a 3D environment, in a complex 3D environment with different tissues, that gets aerosolized and moves from person to person when we talk about a respiratory pathogen. And nobody has cracked that puzzle. Only evolution has, by trying again and again, trillions of times, what amino acids you have to tweak on the outside so that then suddenly you can infect respiratory tissue and then get encapsulated into these air bubbles when you burst out or whatever. So we don't know how to do that in science, not yet. Maybe in the future we will, but at the moment we don't. And also the other problem is that bad viruses, so SARS-CoV-2 ancestors likely came from bat, but SARS-CoV-2 is a human pathogen. So there's a certain gap that needs to be explained, because bad viruses are gastrointestinal, and SARS-CoV-2 is a human respiratory pathogen. So where did the virus learn to do this, right? And, the idea that, you just throw in a furin cleavage site and this is what did the trick, is actually completely wrong. This is not how it works at all, right? Because a virus is a complex molecular machine, and you throw something in and everything falls apart. And the furin cleavage site does not, necessarily make a pathogen more dangerous or less dangerous. There's, everything has to play together with different sites. It's called epistasis in genetics, I think, or virology as well, where you have to say, okay, it's this stepwise adaptation to, the virus exploring new routes of transmission via modifying multiple places at once, and then realizing that these things work, and then suddenly he is adapted to a new environment. This is not something in the lab that we can yet do. And we have good molecular evidence also for some of these things in SARS-CoV-2 that clearly point to an adaptation in an intermediate animal and that it's not the virus right out of the bat. I'm telling this because this is important in the sense of the bad woman, Xi Li, in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right? The initial suspicion was on her lab because they have the most bat samples, right? They were collecting bats from southern China, from the other Chinese provinces. They have like 10,000 bat samples in the lab. But, this only matters if what we are talking about is the leakage of a bad virus, but it's not a bad virus that escaped. It's a virus that is already a pandemic-ready generalist human pathogen. So clearly something must have happened and nobody in the lab would have known how to create this virus. So this is the upstream problem that I say, okay, nobody knew how this virus could have come about via any type of human manipulation. And it would have been very unlikely to find this human virus in bats. So if Shengli had, for example, collected samples from wild animals that were smuggled along the wildlife chain, we're talking about pangolins or raccoon dogs or whatever, would be a different story. Then you could argue, maybe if they had collected, from these wildlife markets themselves, these viruses and cultured them, maybe then it escaped. Much more plausible for the virus we observed. But this is the upstream problem. And the downstream problem that they have is that, all the evidence that we have verified about the epidemiology, the hospitalization, the cases,
all originates.
everything that Peter talks about, that points to this wet market in Wuhan and far away from the lab. So this evidence that is verified, any type of scientific theory you have about the laboratory accident has to explain how it could create a pattern that looks exactly as if it came from this market.
Yeah.
And
I think when I was doing all my research for this, learning, oh God, we've read so much on learning about like the furin cleavage site and why this is advantageous. And all this, there's like all this molecular biology stuff. Okay. I'm from the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Okay. That's all I knew. Okay. But like learning about this, like RXXR and RRXR and all the, not fun. Okay. Anything having to do with the protein is not fun. But the most compelling argument that I thought, there are a lot of very compelling arguments, but the one, and this sucks because I feel like it's actually one of the easier ones to understand, is like this idea of like cryptic transmission outside of the wet market that just shows up. That's like impossible. The idea that this virus was circulating for a month or months prior to showing up at the wet market and it doesn't spread from anywhere else. There aren't hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations. Like there's so much, like you said, epidemiological data. We know how it spreads. We've seen it happen in country after country after country and place after place after place.
Always similar,
the exact
right?
same, basically.
Anytime it's introduced in a new place, in a new city, we have, very similar patterns. Also about these polytomies, so how the virus, when it's introduced, starts spreading the viral tree, the family tree, right? And when we look in what happened in Wuhan, we have 2 family trees. Why is that? Probably because it didn't leak once or twice from the lab, or more likely because there was a pool of infected animals. The virus had been circulated in this pool of infected animals and it spread over more than once.
Yeah.
And this also explains the idea that, the original SARS-CoV-2 virus was not super infectious in the sense like the later variants that, it could have died out by itself. Like it, transmits forward once or twice, but then, these people go home, lie in bed, don't infect anybody else, the virus dies down. And so then we have very good simulations to say actually, you need probably like 8 introduction into the human population for 2 lineages to take off. And if you really take this argument serious, then it makes clear that it was not 8 different lab leaks that happened at the time and 2 were successful. It's clear that there was a dangerous human-animal interface, a very risky human-animal interface established at this wild market where people, immune-naive humans came in, went shopping there, day after day, thousands of people, and eventually 2 of them took off and started taking Wuhan and then the world by storm, right?
Yeah. I feel like that by the time I was like halfway through that Peter debate, basically my position was like, if I feel like they're fighting on the lab leak side, there has to be an explanation for how sick people were hidden or something. Because if you give the early epidemiological data from the wet market, it's like impossible. Unless you have a lab leak theory that includes somebody like taking it from the lab, like in a jar, smuggling it to the wet market, then infecting animals. And then, which by the way, like I'll still admit, and I'm sure you would as well, that could be possible, maybe, right? But I just don't think people understand the gravity sometimes of the claim they make, where a thing might seem kind of simple, but it's actually almost mathematically impossible for it to have happened, right? Like the cryptic transmission for months prior to somebody at the wet market getting infected, and then whoever infected them at the wet market not infecting anybody else.
It's the same argument with the 3 sick with workers that, I think Peter is good explain.
Oh my
like
God.
If you have, young researchers, 3 of them hospitalized, we know COVID, how it works. different age demographics, you would have, hundreds of elderly people in hospitals already. And they talk about 3 sick workers in October.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, when people mix up dates or when people do things like that, like, oh yeah, like the first one might have actually been in like early October or something, or maybe even late August. And it's like, do you understand when you say that there should be hundreds of thousands of cases so much earlier? Like it's just, that's impossible. And then, yeah, like you said, like for hospitalization.
The pandemic 2 months forward. And then,
it's just, it's the math is impossible to beat there. And then also the problem is I feel like some of the science it's not very accessible. So when you've got like, was it Dr. Radcliffe? When people say things like, oh, like the virus has like human arginine, it's like, well, I don't know what that means. And then I have to learn about like amino acids. And it's like, oh, I see. This is actually an incredibly stupid statement. But like you have to, how do you even get to the point of saying that? Or like, were these things like inserted into the virus? Like the Fear and Cleavage site, and it's like, okay, well, what is the difference between an out-of-frame insertion, in-frame insertion? And it's like, there's a lot of like science to chew through. And it sucks because these podcast environments, in my opinion, are actually ideally suited for exactly this type of stuff.
It can be, yes.
But it just becomes like instead of like, oh, here's a news bit, it just becomes like 100 news bits where you don't actually dive into the subject matter. You just get like a Weinstein on to give you all the conspiracy theories, and then that's it. And it's like, Jesus, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from our experience, it's also, it's hard to follow sometimes, scientists getting too deep, and it's also tricky to kind of maintain audience. Because, people get bored or they lose track, and, who has time to sit down for an hour lecture or 2-hour lectures? It's way more fun to sit in with somebody who has a very deep voice and talks very confidently about, world-shattering events every other day. I mean, it's way more entertaining, but this is a bit of the asymmetry that unfortunately plagues us. And I think in 2022 was then when I realized, something else was going on with this lab leak theory, and where I really started digging then into, I talked to researchers that were studying conspiracy theories and that were, advising the European Union on, choice architectures for social media and how to change them and how these kind of start shaping behavior. René Rester might be a person, as well, that we started, collaborating a bit, or at least I interviewed her. We're not really collaborating on this, to try to figure out what goes wrong online, right? And we also see with the lab leak story that at some point they moved away from trying to even argue a scientific case for the lab leak theory, but instead tried to kind of, prove. They basically said, the cover up was perfect. That's why we can never find any evidence for the lab leak. Therefore, all we can do is find evidence of the cover up. And so that's what they are then doing with all these, we're going to subpoena 10,000, Slack messages and look for suspicious words and then claim these people have been, paid off by Anthony Fauci or whatever. So this is basically the layer then, because in our human idiosyncrasies, you will always be able to find something that can be misinterpreted and then rolled out as, look at this, they knew they were covering up. But actually, nobody is really making any scientific case anymore for a lab leak. Like, nobody's even trying to find any evidence, which is kind of also weird if you think about it, because, the scientists that look at the origin, they say, let's try to disprove the market hypothesis. Like Warby was a lab leaker, wrote a famous letter with, Jesse Bloom and others, Alina Chan as well, and say, let's disprove the market hypothesis. And then what he did, he started let's look at all the early cases and see that this was ascertainment bias. And then it's like, oh, it wasn't. Actually, 7 hospitals independently identified all these patients. And it looks like, we made this case a lot stronger for the market. Okay, but then let's look inside the market. The Chinese authority says there was no wildlife there. Environmental sample shows we have raccoon dog DNA and bamboo rat and, all the other animals in these, sequences there. So clearly, the animals were there. And, if you just look at, the market hypothesis basically tried to disprove and made it stronger and stronger. This is exactly how science approximates, ever more likely truths, right? Because you try to disprove something, and then you do your studies, and then it comes out, actually we cannot discard the market, it still continues. And to this point, there has been no study that could disprove the market hypothesis. In fact, all the evidence we have it's the strongest evidence we have for any kind of outbreak, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
To really say very strongly that this outbreak happened because of a zoonotic spillover.
Yeah, and I think that the frustrating part is that, like, as somebody who, and I would even say, like, I barely have any education in this area. I'm a college dropout, okay? So it's just the things that I've managed to read in the meantime. But, like, my interpretation, of the science would be that, a month out, you basically have no more scientific analysis you can do. At that point, you basically have to look at, like, government records or something. Like, that's kind of like my assumption. Like, I didn't realize how many insanely powerful scientific arguments that you could make relating to, as you said earlier, like the backbone of the virus, or related to, like people say it was engineered to perfectly infect humans, but there were certain mutations. I don't remember them now. The D614G or whatever mutate. There are things that happened like in a single generation because it was maladapted to humans to some extent. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then these things start to pop up over and over again, and you're like, oh, geez. And then one of my favorite arguments that Peter made that I thought was an incredibly powerful argument is that if you were to take just one piece of evidence that exists right now in favor of the market, and you were to just move one piece of evidence over to the lab leak, the lab leak would be almost like 100%. Like imagine if the origin of the infections, right, at the epidemiological data originated from the lab. Yeah, it would be over. Yeah. Imagine if, like 30, 40, 50% of your first cases all came from, areas around the lab. Or imagine, oh my God, the fact that in 2014, a researcher went and visited the market and took a picture of the exact stall.
Eddie Holmes, yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God. Like that's just insanity. That's the exact stall was like, there might be bad stuff that comes from, if you were to flip any one of these pieces of evidence in favor of lab leak, it would be like, it's almost certainly that.
It's over. And that's the thing, right? Many of these studies that happened in, 2021, 2022, some of these could have gone either way, right? And all the time they went to the zoonotic side and not for lab leak. And like you said, all the lab leak side needed is to get one, because, look at the genome, right? I mean, it's very obvious if you manipulate the genetic genome, you put in a new sequence that doesn't exist and there you go, right? It doesn't happen. What happens is this furin cleavage site that we weren't really sure where it came from, and then you figure out actually we find them in bats. We find that these insertions happen all the time, right? The RPD, right? This new RPD, that's the key that opens the door to human infection, right? Yeah. You figure out that if any of this would have been in any lab protocol, in any paper published from anyone anywhere, it would be clear that this must be, the smoking gun. Turns out they found it in smuggled pangolins, a sequence before the pandemic in Nature. Again, this. So, all the evidence that could have fallen one way or the other falls on one side. And, science is not so much about having the perfect proof. It's more about triangulating with different lines of evidence, different people, different methodologies, different studies, all converging around the larger picture. And this is exactly what we observe.
And even if you don't have like the hardcore molecular biology arguments, like some of the statistical things or some of like the historical things aren't really known either. I didn't know them either. Like for instance, the fact that we don't actually have the spillover event for SARS-CoV-1, but for SARS-CoV-2, like we found it's not RETG13, I think. It's the Banal 53 or whatever. Like we found a closer match, like in the caves, like we found a closer match to SARS-CoV-2 than we ever found for SARS-CoV-1 for a species in terms of like the percentage nucleotide match. But then another argument that Peter brings up that I thought was really good was, I don't actually think, for a person that believes in lab leak, that's like spiritually committed to it, I don't think there's actually any piece of evidence that you could find, because every piece of evidence works for lab leak too if you really want it to. Yes. So for instance, if we were to find the exact SARS-CoV-2 virus, the initial one, if we were to find that in bats in a cave or something, then they would just say like, oh, well, look, if you found it in a cave and they were sampling down there, then they did bring it back. They just didn't like document it. And then it leaked, so every piece of evidence you think you can find for zoonosis, which truly, like if you're evaluating fairly, that would support the zoonotic spillover idea, they can always morph it into like a lab leak theory somehow pointing event. And it's like,
one great example is from one of the authors of a paper. He basically told me, look, one point they say, where's the intermediate animals? So the Chinese CDC came and, the market vendors were warned, and so there were no animals there, so they couldn't take samples from the animals at the market, right? And this is a gap, basically, that, why did it happen? And, I know why it happened, but we don't have to go into it. But this piece of evidence is technically missing, right? To find the virus in these animals at the market, because we just didn't get this data.
Yeah.
But if we had this data, the argument would just be, it's because, the humans brought it to the animals and infected the animals. And then you can spin this thought further. Okay, let's go to the wildlife farms that supply this market, and you find a predecessor virus of SARS-CoV-2 in this wildlife farm, still somewhere in some carcasses or whatever, right, from this supplying things. Then they would still say, maybe, the this is the animals that were, brought back from the market to the farm and infected the animals there. And that's why, we have positive animals at the market. And you think this sounds crazy, but then you look back at SARS-1, and this is exactly what happened with SARS-1. SARS-1 was spreading in wildlife for a long time. The animals, once they figured out they came from the market, the animals were brought back to farm, and some of these, infected then basically from the farm, right? And so you can spin this idea whatever. So there's no amount of scientific evidence that can solve an emotional kind of belief, right?
There's a joke that I make. Have you ever seen the movie Contagion?
Yes.
It looks like a very cringy movie about like COVID, but then when you realize it came out like 10 years earlier, and it's like, oh, because I think that pandemic started in that movie from like, it was like a bat pooping on a pig or whatever, and then the pig going to some market and getting
it's based on a real case study by Peter Daszak, funnily enough. Did you know? And Linda Wang. So the background is actually my first chapter in the book. It's about the Nipah virus, which is a virus that is in fruit bats. So these are these huge flying foxes, right? And they found out basically that there was in Malaysia in 1998, 1999, there was this outbreak, and suddenly you said this pig farmers, which in Malaysia is a Muslim country, but you had this Chinese, the Fuzhou Chinese, which were the immigrants there. They were pig farmers because they were allowed to touch the pigs, the Muslims, right? And you said all these pig farmers suddenly die, right? And people are like, what's going on? They thought it was Japanese encephalitis because they fell into a coma, right? And they thought, it's this mosquito virus. And then it turned out actually it was this bad virus that spilled from animals into pigs. And the way it did is the farmers they had fruit trees around, the animals came, right? And ate the fruit fell down, the animals sniffed up the fruits. And then, at some point the animals contracted this virus. And then this alone wouldn't have caused a pandemic, but then they had multiple spillovers constantly into this pigs, while at the same time the pig farmers had these breeding practices where they would hatch the tiny piglets and then sell them to other farms. And this is basically where it spread from Malaysia all the way to Singapore, right? Because the mother sows had immunity, and as long as the babies were drinking, they would get the antibodies, be immune, right? And then suddenly, they couldn't figure out that, when they said the piglets that, on the way out, they would get then the Nipah virus and then transfer it away. So, yeah, crazy story.
Yeah. It's annoying because sometimes people will say things like, well, what are the chances that this happens? Or like, how could this have leaked in this way? And it's like, well, if some of these things wouldn't have happened, then it wouldn't have leaked. People will bring up the fact that, like the argument is almost self-justifying. People will bring up the fact that there were, I think it were 5 or 6 different amino acid changes in the region binding domain that made this like particularly suited to the ACE2 binding. And, it's like, well, what are the chances that this happens? And then, that's the infection thing. It's like, well, if it didn't happen, then it wouldn't have infected us, right? Obviously, like this, it has to happen, It's just like the
survivorship bias in the end, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't know how many lottery tickets Mother Nature has, right?
That too, because there are like trillions of events or hundreds of trillions or quintillions or Googles of events happening every second on the planet in terms of like interactions between cells and animals and everything else. You mentioned something earlier, and I don't know if you have a position or if you coordinate or communicate with other countries or whatever, so you don't have to go into this if you don't want to, but not only on the scientific level, not only on the I don't want to say common sense, on the the mathy level, another level on the political level, I feel like if you look into it too, there's also a lot of things that are just said kind of as truisms that nobody addresses. And one of the things was, I don't know if this is what you were hinting at earlier when you said you don't want to get into it, but people always say like, well, obviously China has a huge incentive in covering it up if it was a lab leak. And it's like, do you think that China says that it was a zoonotic spillover from their citizens eating disgusting animals from a wet market? Like, do you think that they have a political motivation to make it seem like a disgusting farming practice caused a worldwide pandemic? Like, no, they say it came from the United States. That's not their narrative. Because you mentioned when they went to go and do the testing at the wet market, they killed all those animals first, and they had to test like drains and everything else. China doesn't want that story coming out. Like, why would you assume they're any more motivated than that versus saying, oh, well, one of our labs had a gain of function problem because of your diffuse grant or because of whatever other thing you can make up in the United States,
And you captured very well. This is exactly why Chinese citizens themselves believe that it came from the United States, right? And all the evidence we actually have that is verified of Chinese obfuscation and cover-ups concern the wet market. So we know that they lied about the animals being there. We know that they did not trace the animal sources back to the, where they came from. We know they did no testing of or at least they didn't ever admit to do any testing of it. We know that they sent bad researchers out in the beginning of the pandemic to kind of look for bats that have SARS-CoV-2 relatives in order to find a blameless reason for this natural catastrophe, which is how they first wanted to spin it. And then when these researchers found that actually, there's bats and, that have this in China, and the political environment changed, they said like, okay, we don't want any research anymore, and everything got under control of the Chinese Academy of Science and the Health Bureau to kind of, vet all the publications that come out and push this theory that actually it came to the Huanan market via frozen food. And maybe lobsters, maybe fish, maybe whales, whatever. It doesn't matter if it infects these animals or not. And it's very clear that China has no interest at all in kind of put the spotlight on their wildlife trade. It's a $70 billion industry. With the smuggling, it's another 10 billion when we take Southeast Asia on top of that. It employs 14 million people. It was also part of, initiatives from Chinese politicians to close the gap between poverty gap between the rich cities and the poor by saying, let's go and do this wildlife farming stuff as a way to alleviate poverty programs. So there were big political programs rolling out, and that this could have backfired and caused the pandemic is something, of course, the Chinese state does not want out there as a narrative.
Yeah.
And I mean, I write a lot more about this because also we have some inside sources within China that say like, what did they censor, right? You look at, WeChat, right? And you see mentions of the Huanan market was the epicenter. The Huanan market caused the outbreak, got deleted by Chinese censors, but people saying it was the lab didn't get censored, right? From these WhatsApp, at least from two sources that I have. And it's like, okay.
There was like a story like, it might have been December 30th, but there were stories of like all of the original infections originating from, and this was before there was this huge worldwide theory about the wet market or whatever. Yeah, there was also, I thought it was really funny. I don't know if these were ever widespreadly talked about or whatever. I don't know, because all the conversation in America about this is crazy. But in the Chinese wet market, when he was looking at the pictures from before and after, there were like, in one sense, there was like a character was removed from the board. It was very obvious where it was removed. Yeah, and it had to do with live animals. And then like in future pictures, the whole sign is just gone, I feel like that, and I feel like there are, I don't know if you call them like micro facts, like little things. I saw, one dipshit in chat brings up the whole like, oh, it's just a coincidence that the lab was right next to the wet market. It's like, it wasn't right next to it. It was like 12 miles away, okay?
Yeah, that's far away.
It's a very dense city. People will say like, oh, well, it's not that far away. Like in New York City, Manhattan is a small island. Like imagine traveling 12 miles and not infecting anybody with a highly infectious virus from the lab, and then infecting some people at the wet market, and then going home and not infecting any. There's just so many assumptions you would have to make, and there are so many of those like little tiny errors that are not true. People be like, oh, this was the only infectious lab studying this in all of China. It's like, oh, there were lots of labs that were studying these, and then like but nobody brings up the fact that wet market. I think that wet market had more live animal sales stalls than I think any other wet market. I think in all of China, at least in all of Wuhan.
In all of Hubei, I think.
Or maybe Hubei,
the middle of China, or all of middle China, you can say, yes.
Yeah.
And it was the biggest market. Within Wuhan, there were other markets, but it was the biggest ones. And we have, the interesting part, and this is something that also is a little snippet that I really enjoyed, and I don't know if... probably Peter brought it up at some point, that, we have evidence from the Forestry Bureau, which is like, next door to the Huanan market, that they fined the Huanan market owners for owning not the right permissions to sell the wildlife that they were selling, right, from November 2019 and earlier, right? So you have these fines, and they were like, these were not fines in the sense of like, you have to shut down. These were like slap on the wrist fines, like, don't do it. We know what we're doing. And it's been going on since, Eddie Holmes was there 2014. So, this seems like one of these places where new virus could come from. Yeah. And then years later, we have this study from Xiao. These were two different Chinese authors that looked at basically a tick-borne disease in wild animals, and they surveyed by accident, you can say, the Huanan market between 2017 and 2019, and documented, tens of thousands of wildlife sales and what animals they sold, right? And all this kind of information is like, okay, yeah, it was a wildlife market. It had some risky interfaces. They might not always have had the right permissions, although most wildlife trade, even of exotic species, can be legal in China. You just need to have the right permissions that, in reality, of course, there's some messiness around it everybody can understand. And, there's also another point, and this is more speculative, about, the market owner, and he has political connections to the cousin of Xi Jinping. And, in China, some of this wildlife trade that is not legal goes, it's the Red-Black Alliance, so the black market and the tyrants together with some corrupt politicians, looking the other way in order to have this economic, turn for this. So there's a lot of issues locally there that I wished, the intelligence services or journalists would look to have into a little bit deeper, instead of, I don't know, starting to go after Western virologists who clearly have no, no relationship to this outbreak, and then starting to look into emails. So, why is
these researchers that are, not to be, financial leaders, but like these researchers that are getting paid like, 50, 60, 70,000 a year are concocting like these global pandemic conspiracy
and not
things.
only them, but their PhD students, that work on this, and
all the researchers from across different institutions from across the world who all, it's ridiculous. I think the final point just on the conspiracy thing, like another thing I guess that bothered me, or one big thing that bothered me at the end, is that like you mentioned that people gave up on the scientific argument. Like there truly, I don't believe there is a single good piece of scientific evidence that points towards it originating from the lab. It's nothing. And you need people don't realize it, but you need a lot of conjecture just to build towards the scientific argument, right? The fact that some virus was captured with a backbone that was previously unknown, that was made infectious by altering, the RBD in ways that wouldn't have been predicted, that was transferred from live tissue to live tissue, that was, there were so many of these things that would have had to happen. And then that's just starting to build the argument to where you could say, okay, now it's like more likely to be a lab leak. And the fact that they don't even try, but you just get these same tired, stupid things, or people will say like, oh yeah, like the FCS is inserted, and it's like, is it really though? Like, and I think I even heard, this might have even come up where it's like, the in-frame versus out-of-frame insertion is like, well, like if they do an in-frame insertion, well, clearly that's done in a lab. If they do an out-of-frame insertion, well, it's because it was done in a lab and they're trying to trick you. And it's like there's no argument that you can get for anything, and it's like, Jesus Christ, or like, they're using, it's human arginine, because you don't usually find the CGG coding for arginine in viruses. And it's like, okay, well, why would you put that in a lab? It's like, well, to show that it's human. And it's just like, all of it is, there's the scientific evidence is nothing. And
also, most of it is also not true. I mean, that's the next thing. It's just like, these are arguments that are conjured that, from people reading things they don't really understand.
Yeah.
Because, if you're a genetic engineer, you don't include, a genetic sequence that has so many C's and G's, because, this is, a GC ratio of 80% is like, no, it's not going to work.
Sure.
Right. And there's a million reasons also with this out of frame, in frame kind of thing. Is like, nature is agnostic, so you have 2/3 odds that it comes out of frame and 1/3 that it's in frame, right? And in the lab, you never do it out of frame. Basically, there's no point to doing it other than, breaking,
trying to
confusing yourself.
Or to hide it from people.
Like I said, every piece of evidence that could have fallen, either way somehow fell on the zoonotic side. So the scientific argument, I think, is long gone. And I think what has happened instead is that, there was a ramp up of, persuading the public differently by throwing doubt on science and scientists, by creating narratives that are mostly fear-based and speculative, but have a strong emotional appeal. I mean, the best stories you hear, right? These are like tropes about, I don't know, Frankenstein or Icarus, they were trying to, create a new vaccine, and then, they flew too close to the sun and now we all suffer for it. So these are like really powerful story tropes, and it's a very easy intuition to sell when you're on the lab leak side, because you have to basically just tell people, somebody in that lab up, and you can never exclude an accident, and this is what happened. Somebody up, let's blame them, let's go. For the zoonotic side, do you want to spend, 5 months, like Peter said, to educate people on, the epidemiology gives us one clue, and then, we look at the phylogenetics, this gives us another clue, and then if we look at, previous research, and we look about the history, and, how can zoonotic spillover happen, and what did they do in the lab? And like, people are like, no, I don't care. And then even worse than that, right, the lab leak has a positive notion in the sense, like, if we can just stop the scientists, very concrete. We stop the scientists. We don't have to worry about going through such a traumatic pandemic that killed, over 1 million Americans ever again. And what is the answer what's the hopeful answer that the zoonotic hypothesis proves is like, everybody is a bit responsible, economic incentives, our infringement into natural habitats, Western buying consumption, everybody, or failing politicians, everybody played a role in making a pandemic as bad as it was. And we cannot really prevent the next one either. So why would you want to buy into this kind of story? It's a terrible story to buy into.
Yeah,
unfortunately, it seems to be that's the reality.
There's this thing I try to make people aware of where people sell comfort, but it wears the aesthetic of discomfort, where, some guy will get up and he'll say something like, I'm about to tell you a really uncomfortable truth. And the uncomfortable truth is that, like, the billionaires or the scientists are all out to get you. And it's like, ooh, but it's like, that's not actually an uncomfortable truth at all. That's actually incredibly affirming to that individual's worldview. Yes. And it's also, like you said, it's very satisfying. Like, I can blame a handful of people. Like, that feels really good. It's not satisfying to have a dispersion of blame. And it's definitely not satisfying to imagine that the blame might somehow necessitate a change in individual behavior because of threats to environment, scientific research, or whatever. Like, it's unsatisfying for a variety of reasons. It causes you to have to change your own behavior ways you don't want, and you don't get the right person to blame, and it just doesn't satisfy your political ends. What I feel like one of the things I have a big issue I have in the United States is I feel like there was this, Joe Rogan said this, and it's lived in my mind forever, where he was talking to somebody, and they repeat this a lot. They go, a lot of the conspiracy theorists happen to be right about a lot of stuff. And it's funny because if you go back like 5 years, the conspiracy theorists were basically wrong about everything. There was no mass mRNA injury event. The mRNA vaccines, to my understanding to this day, were the most effective vaccines. They were better than China's. They were better than Russia's. There was no mass lockdowns forever where the government made you had all these things. We never found evidence for lab leak. We never, none of the things that they said would happen. But then going forward, and then politically, we have like things like the 2020 election was rigged. I feel like 10 or 20 years from now, it feels like these things are going to be taught as though there was like legitimate, intelligent disagreement on them. That, it was or even that, like, back then, likely it leaked from a lab, but, some people thought that it could have been a zoonotic thing. Or, that you have this world where it feels like a lot of these battles are lost, and I don't know what it's going to look like in the future. The 2020 election is a big one for Americans as well. There's no evidence, negative evidence. Well, there's evidence that somebody tried to rig the 2020 election, but it's a whole political thing with Trump. But it's very out in the open. It's not a conspiracy at all. Yeah. But yeah, with like COVID stuff, with vaccine stuff, it feels like the battles have been lost on this already, and it's just going to be in the future, like having to tell our kids or grandkids. It's like, I know that little Jimmy and like half the class are all saying that the mRNA vaccines, made a lot of us sick and poisoned us, but like that's just a total lie. Like, yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about that, or what's your stance on that, or do you still think that these are issues that can be fought on and won on?
I mean, part of me believes that, otherwise I wouldn't have written this book, right? It's a kind of a chronicle to what really happened, right? From featuring primary testimony from people that were at the center of it. And, so the hope is that, and I think it works. So everybody who has read the book, and journalists as well, here in Switzerland, they were like, this is actually a perspective on the pandemic that is important to have. So I'm confident, and I have one example or two examples that are a bit a hopeful vision. But that does not mean that, it's going to be an easy fight. It does not mean that the fight is not lost at the moment. But, you have to think about it as a game, right? Is it like a game without end, or is it a game that, then you play the next round, right? And some of these, I would say history is, constantly being argued and rewritten by the winners. And at the moment, we see the attempt to do that, but that doesn't mean that, we have to take it lying down for the rest of eternity. Mm-hmm. And now, to give you a positive example, this is something I talked to people from, they were working on conservation projects in Western Africa, and when the Ebola outbreak happened, right? Ebola most likely spilled over from monkey in this case, so from bats. Ebola is also likely a bat virus originally, and we have good evidence now to suggest it came from bat, but origin not established, let's put it like this. Yeah. But then it come via the spills over to monkeys, and then people go butcher the monkeys and sell the little chimps or whatever to rich Saudis. Terrible story anyways. And so they had the Ebola outbreak, right? And when people said, this was a zoonotic spillover, blah blah blah, the conspiracy theories were a lot stronger, saying, there was a US lab there. Maybe they did experiments on Africans, like they did in the past.
Sure.
And so people did not want to believe that their interaction with, deforestations, killing the last rainforest in Western Africa, has any impact on this, right? And then when COVID came, actually, this is when the narrative shifted. It's like, it's a different place, another zoonotic spillover causing a devastating outbreak for many people. And so these people suddenly rewrote their own history about the Ebola outbreak and say, this was actually not a lab leak. Now most people believe this was actually a zoonotic spillover. And another example, and this I give you, this is even further in history, another traumatic pandemic, 1918 influenza, right? The Spanish flu, or what was it called, or the German flu at some point. So in the US specifically, people thought that, the Germans were behind it because, World War I, Germans were the enemy. And they thought that aspirin, basically, that was kind of one of these wonder drugs that I think Bayer developed back then. Aspirin kind of was the agent that caused influenza. And this has a reason, because people were over prescribing aspirin back in the day to treat it. They gave like 100 times higher dose, and this caused liver damage, and so people died a bit more often. And so this was this connection basically that said, the German caused this, right? And then this was like no mitigation measures, no public health measures were put in place. And then it took, I think, 10 or 12 years, and the next influenza epidemic started rising in the US. And suddenly people started switching, we have to do public health, we have to, mask, we have to do different things to contain. And then, people kicked into action and kind of rewrote the history of the first pandemic as well. This was like 12 years later. So the one possibility is like when the next crisis arrives, that people will look back at COVID and say, we've seen this before, maybe it was natural because now we have another natural pandemic, might it be flu, might it be Nipah, might it be the next thing that comes. But I don't know. I mean, at the moment, if we don't change what's broken in our information ecosystem, it could be that we perpetually will keep people so engaged in alternative realities that they have no interest anymore in ever coming back to reality. But
yeah,
that's what I would say.
I don't know if I guess the biggest concern that I have is that the internet has made all of this so much more accessible. So like, I don't know, that one issue that I have is like the aesthetic of things, that nowadays everybody has this aesthetic of like rationality. Like you get all these like pseudo scientific dipshits, like all these Weinstein losers, or the Dr. Robert Malone dipshit. Like you get these people like doctors, and they're pushing all their scam bullshit. Oh my God, it's funny. In that movie Contagion, do you remember the guy pushing, he called it Forsythia or whatever? And you still, like, if you ask people today, there are still, my guess would be over half the conservatives in America today still think that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are effective treatments for COVID. They probably still believe that today. But I feel like there's so much more of a connection to the average person, whereas maybe in the past, the average person wouldn't have had a strong opinion on it. Now everybody has a strong opinion on it because they heard all the people on Joe Rogan or whatever. But I hope you're right. And maybe it's 50-50, or maybe it's more likely that, like in 10 or 15 years, as the political narratives change, people look back with a more sober mind, and then they just pretend that they never held the opinion. Like everybody in America now, if you ask them, I have no idea how we went to war with Iraq at all, because apparently everybody was always against it. If you ask anybody today, and I say, I was always against the Iraq war, it's like, why did most of Congress, everybody vote for, the UAMF to go to Iraq before? Yeah. But so I don't know, maybe that'll happen. Who knows?
No, you have to be very worried at the moment, because you have to think about this. I mean, 9/11 was a traumatic catalyst that basically enabled the the much sought after invasion that the Bushes dreamed of Iraq, right? Without it, I think many scholars agree, without 9/11 as a catalyst and, Muslims and terrorism being on the forefront of everybody's mind, it would have been hard to sell this invasion to the American public. But now the trauma of the pandemic is much bigger. Way more American lives are lost. And so what is going to happen when the Trump administration has gotten rid of the internal enemies? I mean, any type of autocratic or fascist movement needs an enemy within or without, right? And a lot of the Labnik narrative that they are using is basically to escalate tensions with China. Now, I mean, the Project 2025 authors, right? They have had a COVID origin commission with, some of the people that were driving this, and also are in the Trump administration again, basically is asking of 18 trillions in compensation from China for causing the pandemic, right? And you see potential angles how they could use this emotional trigger, this trauma again and again in order to, get people behind, the administration to go to maybe war, maybe conflict or whatever it is with, something like China, which anyway has been, not something that some conservatives have been asking for that for a long time. And, no, not to say that China is a nice place and you shouldn't go for war, but, there is probably more to that, and there's better ways to think about the future than just escalating tensions to the point where you use false stories to whip up your own citizens to do as you please and not question the leader. And I see worrying trends in the US, of course, I think you do too, about how the confluence of elite failure, institutional failure, with this personality cult around Trump and the modern information ecosystem and the billionaire oligarchs that own it kind of all seem to kind of align towards, an alternative view of the world and alternative stories of that, right?
I mean, and I would even say the scarier thing is it's because I sometimes you get stuck in this world of having to, like, if anybody on your side makes even the slightest mistake, you get the other side saying things like, well, that's why I don't trust this side anymore. But then when you look at their side, it's like, well, your side like 400 things. Why do you trust that side? That doesn't make any sense. How are you so skeptical? And, some people will say, and I used to say this, and I try not to anymore, is it like, yeah, sure, like, the institutions fail sometimes, or there's reasons why you might not. It's like, I don't think that's true over the COVID. I think that's actually bullshit. I had a person in chat point out, like, how fascinating is it that me, as like an actual random retard in Miami, Florida, can look up like the nucleotide sequence of the original SARS-CoV-2 and compare it in research papers. Like, we have so much information, and I thought the everything, nobody can talk about it now, but like everything relating to the creation of the mRNA vaccines, like how quickly they were able to get them out, all the technology around those nanolipid particles and everything, and for the delivery of all of it into your body, like all of this stuff was so cool and so awesome. And I feel like institutionally there was a really good response in general. Like, was it perfect? Maybe not, but like, damn, I feel like it was commendable. But the issue that you have is the reality that's being created by a lot of these podcaster people. It's not even so much that we're getting like these, the Tuskegee experiments that are going on. It's like, oh my God, they're still experimenting on black people, other people. It's like, it's not even like the institutions making these horrible things. It's like all of these stupid misquotes and the false reality that a lot of these podcasts are showing you. I remember I used to not debate, but just go back and forth on these Twitter threads about the vaccines, where everybody was like, they said that if you got the vaccine, it was 100% going to protect you from everything. And here's like 10 quotes that say that. And it's like, okay, well, let's look at the source of every single quote. And you run down all of these, and like every single quote, like it's obvious when you look at the paragraph that came before it, they're saying like, yeah, if you get vaccinated, the chances of spreading it are lower. So people need to get vaccinated so that we don't spread the disease. And they'll just quote that last part. Oh, they said people need to get vaccinated so we don't spread the disease, claiming that it was 100%. And, it was just like, it's so much false reality created that you're not even fighting with failures of the institution at that point. You're fighting with what people think are failures of the institution. And those failures like didn't even happen. And there's a lot of commendable stuff happening and people can't even take credit for it. And it's very, very, very frustrating.
Yeah, so let me just specialize. So, I mean, in the sense of, democratic checks and balances, institutions and elites, I was thinking not about, scientific failure.
Oh, sure.
I do think that the scientific institutions, they were not perfect. They were not adapted to, have perfect communication or kind of, even navigate the environment very well anywhere around the world. But that doesn't mean that they didn't, do a good job and, like you said, figure out some things and did part of the heavy lifting that, got people through. And you see that in the beginning of the pandemic, actually trust increased in science and scientists, because in the very beginning, people got to see science in action and doing things. And then, you saw the switch after, when the pandemic frustration, the pandemic continued. And then, I think the winter of 2020 was really like the first one where people really started the emotional drainage of, yet another wave. And then this opened the door for this alternative podcasters and heterodox spheres and whatever to start, chipping away at trust in order to, abuse the trauma and the frustration to proliferate themselves and then, ultimately use it to their advantage at the detriment of, the public good.
Yeah. What is your where do you market your book at? I should link that in chat.
Market? I don't market.
Or market? Where I mean, like, where can be? I'm sorry. Where do you sell? Where can people buy your book that you're?
Sure. Yeah.
That's what I meant. Sorry.
So I created a website. It's called Lab Leak Fever, like the book. It's www.lab-leak leak-fever.com. So this is usually the easiest one to find. I can also write it. But, honestly, I also, this book was, and we can talk a little bit about this, it was always supposed to come a bit earlier, before, like at the start of this year latest, right? And then, I got issues with my publisher in the US because, it was a small indie publisher. And then, the legal issues became higher and higher because the book does not only outline, the science and what the scientists did, but also, I really go into the depths of some of these disinformation campaigns that were coming directly, from people in Trump's orbit. And the lawyers were like, nope. From the publisher after Trump won, they killed the book very quickly. And so, I was a bit panicked, and then I had to, figure out what to do. And in the end, it's just me who tries to get the word out. So, yeah, it's a bit fascinating in the US that, free speech, but only if you have the money. That is a bit tricky.
Yeah, one of the issues in the U.S. is and I'm sure this is true to some extent with all people, but people will have very strong principles or morals around certain things, but they don't actually. There's actually hidden qualifiers on all of these things, and the hidden qualifiers have to do with political allegiance, basically, because we have a strong history in the U.S. of conservatives saying they have these the "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and the Second Amendment is going to protect us if they come after our First Amendment, and states' rights and all of that. But Trump is operating as much as an authoritarian as the American system will allow him to. And I'm just arguing with conservatives. I just argued with one, I think 2 nights ago, where I'm like, don't you think it's a bad look that the president of the United States is suing people for things that he doesn't like? And the conservative response is like, well, it's legal, isn't it? And it's like, that's not really the point, it's astounding, the attack on freedom of speech, on First Amendment rights from the Republican establishment in ways that you've just never seen. Like, Democrats could only dream of being this heavy-handed. When you had Mark Zuckerberg come out on Joe Rogan and say, yeah, we decided to get rid of fact-checking on Facebook because we realized it was very liberally biased. And I'm like, are you kidding me right now? Like, why are you even making this concession? Like, this is so stupid. Holy shit. Yeah.
No, this is frustrating. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know what to say. It's I wish you the best. I mean, we've been working. I think the EU should do more to help, democratic citizens in the US, provide support for scientists to also, take up some of the slack that the failing or the crumbling infrastructure in the US now has to stomach. Because, if you want democracies to survive in the future, and the US is the biggest democracy there is, and was a very stable pillar for a very long time, if the US falls or, continues its autocratization, it's very worrying for all of us. So that's why I think everybody in Europe looks, with big eyes on what's going on in the US, and everybody is wondering, where's the resistance? Especially the elite resistance, not so much the people, because the people go on the street. The everyday people are like, I don't think that's okay. I don't think this is good. I'm not agreeing to this. I didn't know about this, or whatever it is. I mean, you talk to people that are also not, that are not happy with, some of the things that are happening, right? But where are the elites? Like, where is the leaders, the institutional leaders? Where is the politicians that say, look, we do a bit more? I think Gavin Newsom, some people now, I think I saw a bit earlier today, or maybe
he's going to be our guy. Newsom is going to be our guy. He'll make it.
Have you ever? So you see some, and resistance takes time to emerge. I understand, but I also feel like it's high time, and I would have hoped that much of it happened sooner than at the very last moment. But democracy always starts a bit off the back foot if you talk to anybody in an emerging, democracy. It's not easy, and I think people have to wake up and realize that it's on all of us, and everybody can do their little part. For me, it's like let's do this one little thing that I knew because of my background and that luck that I had of meeting all these people to just correct the record on this one tiny thing that somehow still is huge in the Trump orbit. It's like everybody has to be a lab leaker, otherwise you're not part of the group there.
Yeah.
Trump has this website where he like runs out like, like a movie. It's like,
Yeah, it's insane. The one of the things I joke, you mentioned the elite, like I keep saying, like when I look at like Ukraine, I'm like, where is my, military industrial complex? I thought they were supposed to be running everything. Why aren't we giving them more weapons, Or where is Big Pharma? Why are we canceling all of our scientific research? I thought Big Pharma was supposed to be running the country. Or why are all of my social media titans, bending the knee to Trump? I thought the billionaires were supposed to control everything. It was like, have you watched have you ever heard of Game of Thrones? Have you watched Game of Thrones?
I never watched Game of Thrones.
Oh,
I heard about it.
There's a scene where some guy who's like really rich or whatever, and he has a lot of information. He like looks at the queen of one of the kingdoms, and he's like, "Oh, like knowledge is power." And then she looks at him, and she has her knife. She's like, "Oh, maybe we should just cut your throat." And the guy's like, "Oh my god!" And she's like, "Actually, power is power." And I feel like there is a lot of power in the presidency of the United States, and a lot of the political is more important than because I thought all the billionaires would be standing up to Trump and doing all this, and they're not. They're like, "Oh, please, sir, give us like reprieve from the tariffs, and we'll get rid of our fact checkers for you, and we'll settle our cases." And it's cringe. Yeah.
So this is one of the interesting things that I noticed from tracking this lab leak story from the beginning to today. Is like it doesn't shift randomly. It shifts always with who is in power, right? When Trump was in power, it was this the bioweapons and China did this maliciously. The military was involved. Blah 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 blah. Then Biden came into power and people moved towards maybe it was an accidental lab leak. It was the left people driving the RFK types and like the anti-biotechnology interest groups that say, this was like a gain of function research. This was a Franken virus, from Franken foods, the GMO to Franken virus. So it was the left people that are driving this kind of narrative for their purposes. And now Trump is back in power, and you see suddenly, forget all about that. Maybe keep the gain of function because we like it now that we are anti-vaccine too. But let's really talk about bioweapons again. So you see, who is in power really shapes also, what is the dominant conspiracy narrative there.
Yeah. All right. I mean, unless you have anything else.
I hear my baby crying, so I have to jump off.
Okay. Hopefully you guys don't do like the Swedes and leave them outside when it's cold. I don't know if that's just a Swedish thing.
No. I have to.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot for the chat. I really appreciate it.
To you. And hit me up if there's anything coming up in this topic. Happy to share with you whatever you need.
Cool.
In case you want to debate.
Awesome. I appreciate it.
You.
Yeah. Have a good one, man.
Thank you.